Greetings, people of the interwebs, Jake here. So it's been about a month since I last uploaded anything, because work has been very busy, and then took a 10-day hiking trip to Oregon at the end of August, and then as soon as I came back, got super busy again, and will probably continue to be so, probably even more so. But digressing, because that's not what you came here to watch this video for. You came because of the title of this video. So, I'm sure a lot of people watching this, unless you're just like a hardcore Tolkien nerd, were not aware that Tolkien had started a draft for a sequel to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, called The New Shadow. Now, he didn't get very far. He only wrote about like 15 pages, and he ultimately decided to kind of scrap it, and I'll dive a little bit into that, to why he decided to scrap it, but like, I still find it really fascinating that because I do think the idea is really cool. So essentially, The New Shadow takes place, or listed in the original draft, which I think he was working on this story, I believe it was like early 70s, like around 1972, so actually shortly before he passed away. But anyway, so the idea of the plot for The New Shadow is it takes place about 100 years or so after Aragorn's death, in the Fourth Age, and it centers around this character named Borlas, who is the son of Baragond, which that name will mean nothing to you unless you've read the books. So Baragond is so I guess a little bit of context. So Baragond is a character, a minor character in The Return of the King, but a very important character. He was a guard of the Citadel, and befriended Pippin, or Pippin befriended him. And so the two became really close. And Baragond was also incredibly loyal to Faramir, and actually, when Denethor was about to burn Faramir alive, or burn him and himself, Faramir alive, Baragond actually ended up killing some of the other his fellow Gondorian, just that way he could save Faramir, because he was just that loyal and dedicated. So a little bit of brief backstory on this character Borlas, because it's kind of important because since the story takes place around 100 years, and Borlas is at this point a very old man, but probably some people are wondering like how he's over 100 years old. So that's due to Baragond's Númenórean ancestry. So much like Aragorn, Faramir, and even Boromir, and obviously Denethor, they were of Númenórean heritage, and so basically the kind of the I guess more pure blooded, for lack of a better term, because I feel like that's kind of that holds negative connotations to it. But anyways, so the ones that had more Númenórean ancestry, I'll just put it that way, like Aragorn, typically had longer lifespans, even by the point of the late Third Age. Because, Aragorn was 87 during the War of the Ring and died, I think he was like 130, something like that. I could be wrong. I don't remember the exact age, but he was well into his hundreds. And so that's why Borlas is, again, older man, probably like a little over 100, and he's still, I think in like the text, Borlas, himself even admits it, like, he's maybe got a few good years left before his time is up, just due to old age. But anyway, so Borlas is, and kind of what makes him so important, is the fact that Borlas was a young, like, really young kid. At the tail end of the Third Age, he kind of saw the downfall of, like, Sauron and the, essentially, like, golden age of Aragorn's reign. But he also saw kind of like the last vestiges of magic, because, in the Fourth Age, that's when the elves started to leave for Valinor, and the elves that did remain, kind of became a bit more reclusive, because they were in small numbers, much like the dwarves. The dwarves kind of like toiled away in the mines and, crafting, because that's kind of like what they did. And obviously the hobbits were always very reclusive anyways, and so I imagine, a few hundred years in the future, after several generations, I'm sure it'd be documented that, like, hobbits were instrumental in the downfall of Sauron, but there'd probably be people, like most, if not everyone, at this time period in Minas Tirith, or in the Kingdom of Gondor, had probably never seen a hobbit before, let alone seen a dwarf or elf, The orcs are likely all wiped out, or again, probably if there are any alive, they're in small numbers, very reclusive. And so essentially, like, the New Shadow takes place in this almost a much less magical part of Middle Earth, or time period in Middle Earth's history. And since this is now kind of like this, a lot of like magic is kind of like faded from Middle Earth. Borlas is one of the few like humans left in Middle Earth who still kind of remembers the days of elves and magic and Sauron and all that stuff. But he's visited by an acquaintance of his named Ceylon. So Borlas at this point, again, older dude, lives by himself. Wife died, and I believe he has 2 sons, maybe one, but one of them in particular, I forget his name, but he's like a high-ranking like officer or captain or something like that in the Gondorian Navy, stationed in Pelargir, so he doesn't get to see him too often. And so Ceylon is an acquaintance of his son's, and so he kind of visits him fairly often just to kind of give him updates on like how his son's going and just, the day-to-day affairs of like the outside world. And basically, through conversation between the two, Borlas starts to get an indication that Ceylon is maybe involved with some shady stuff. Because he kind of comments, and I wish I could remember the exact quote, but he basically comments that, like, he kind of senses, like, evil is almost, like, kind of seeping its way back into the world, and kind of he laments that, he was alive when, like, Sauron was overthrown, and, had kind of wished for more peaceful, hopeful days and stuff like that. Now, granted, Gondor was pretty peaceful because at this point they had pretty much subdued any of like Gondor's enemies, like the Easterlings, the Haradrim, the Southerners of Khand, or anybody else. And so Gondor is peaceful, but basically what we can infer is people all across, or maybe not all across Middle Earth, but at least people in this general area started to kind of like take up with like dark cults, like in Sauron worship. And so basically, like, Tolkien was writing this as a thriller, and that's what I think is so fascinating about this, is the fact that he's completely changing up like the format, and even though there is like this new evil of some kind, like again, since he only wrote 15 pages, we don't really know a whole lot. Really, the only detail that could imply who the villain was a most likely a character named Hedimor. Could also be a place, but based on the context, seems like it's a person, which, further context, so Hedimor was a Black Númenórean. And so, not likely a timeline, if I recall, this would not be the same Hedimor, but more than likely, like, the leader of this new cult was probably taking on the name of Hedimor, as, I guess, probably like an homage or something like that. But obviously that kind of instills, I guess, to the readers, like, a sense of anxiety and kind of knowing that, like, okay, this is probably a bad person because they're taking on the name of Black Númenórean, someone who felt at Sauron's corruption and served him rather than being a member of the faithful like Isildur, Anarion, and Elendil. But again, all we know is the name Hedimor, most likely a person, and probably the main antagonist. But again, I still think it's so fascinating that he could have easily, written a sequel that's more like in line with like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, of like this kind of like grand fantasy adventure. And maybe that's how this story could have ended up had Tolkien pursued it more. But more than likely, it's like even like one of his letters where he talked about why he stopped writing it is because he found it to be like a little too bleak and kind of depressing, because he was like, well, it kind of undercuts like the whole conclusion to the Return of the King is overthrowing evil and basically everyone living happily ever after, more or less. And Also, like Tolkien never liked allegory. Like a lot of people have, uh, put allegory in his works, or you know, used them for like metaphors and all that stuff. And Tolkien admitted that, like, yeah, maybe subconsciously, like some of his stories and themes and stuff like that could have allegory in them, but it was never his intent. He wrote Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit as just pure escapism, and the New Shadow was kind of shaping into more of like a cautionary tale about man's um, contentness, where like in Middle Earth, in the Fourth Age with peace, uh, essentially out of boredom, like men started taking up with like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we just started like worshiping Sauron, the Dark Lord, because he's gone, it won't matter. Um, and also like that, he some of the characters like would make comments about like a lot of manual labor would be considered like orc work, but no one's obviously like seen an orc or anything like that, and like little kids play it like fighting orcs and stuff like that, and but I just like the idea that Tolkien is essentially taking like this more small scale story and a definitely more human story. But I think that's ultimately, well, as he says, why he kind of stopped writing it, because he felt like this would be too, I guess, a little too preachy, and that's not really what he wanted. But ultimately, I think the main reason is he just didn't want this to kind of undercut the, great conclusion to the Lord of the Rings story. And that's also a testament to his skills as one, be able to like craft like a very interesting, compelling like thriller, but also the fact that like he's someone who knew when to end the story, which I think is a big problem with a lot of, not necessarily writers per se, but like a lot of, more so in the movie industry or TV series, where they should have ended, say, a season or two before they did. But the studio was like, well, the show's too popular. We can't just end it now. Let's see if we can squeeze like another 3 seasons out of it. Or same thing with movies, where a movie was supposed to just be like a one and done, great story, and then because it did really well financially, the studio, of course, is kind of like, we like money, so let's make more of these happen. And then they just kind of run these franchises into the ground. And again, I get it; they're business. That's what they're. I get it from a business standpoint, but at the same time, from a creative standpoint, and keeping the integrity of franchises, stuff like that, I think it's important to know when to stop and kind of like, all right, here's the story we told, we're done. We're not going to touch it. It's great. No need to potentially ruin this, or even not necessarily even ruin it, but just kind of like diminish it by making prequels and sequels and stuff like that. Let's leave it as is. That way, it'll forever be regarded as like one of the greatest film trilogies, or in the case of like a TV series, whatever it may be. And that's one thing that I do really respect. The fact is, even though the New Shadow had it's a really cool idea, and I am really curious as a Tolkien fan, like how that story would have like shaped out. But ultimately, I think I am more. I'm probably happier. Or I don't know. I feel like happier is maybe not the right word, but I guess I'd prefer that Lord of the Rings, that story ended, and that's all we got. Because even though I'm sure the New Shadow still would have been a good story, it just would have been completely different from the Lord of the Rings. And I imagine even at the time, like had he completed that story, he released it in like the 70s, it probably still would have been maybe like a mixed reception, where, I'm sure some people would really love the story and kind of like, oh, it was a great addition to the Lord of the Rings, mythos and story. But then other people, I could see them kind of being like, no, it's just tonally so different, and it almost feels like it's in a whole different world. And also, I'm sure a lot of people complained that, like, yeah, it undercut, like, the whole point of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and kind of added an unnecessary sequel. And so, yeah, I think as fascinated as I am to like, in an Elseworld universe, to see, like, had Tolkien completed that story and what it would have looked like, I do think ultimately it's best that he stopped after 15 pages, just because, yeah, he was like, I got a good thing going with Lord of the Rings, and I'll just dabble a little bit more with like my world building and revising and editing and stuff like that, um, and not worry about doing a sequel. Um, but yeah, that's just a video I wanted to do, just because I feel like it's definitely talked about in like the Tolkien community, and especially like I've seen videos where Tolkien YouTubers have discussed this topic as well. Um, but I guess like it's if you're not a huge Tolkien fan, you're probably not following a lot of those channels. Now I don't know why you'd be following this channel either. But all that to say, I guess I kind of wanted to make a video for the more casual audience who just happens to stumble across this video. Um, that yes, there was a sequel that Tolkien was working on for the Lord of the Rings, but he didn't finish it. Um, so yeah, give me your thoughts. Would you have liked him to finish that story, or do you think it's best that he kind of canned it before he got too much further invested into it? You leave your thoughts below. Uh, I'll try to upload whenever I can, but can't guarantee it. It might be this channel might go dormant for another month or so, but I will try to stay as active as I can with my busy schedule. But thanks for the people who do stick around and continue to like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. So until next time, everyone, cheers.